Hi, Redeemer family. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Redeeming Truth. Today, we have an old friend coming back on our podcast, Craig Hawkins, Professor Craig Hawkins from Trinity International University. He is a scholar and a friend, and somebody who has been incredibly helpful in this whole area of social justice. I know we did 3 sermons, 4 Q&As, and 5 podcasts on this. But some things have happened since our last podcast that we really need to talk about, and that's why we're here today. So before we jump into that, I just want to make sure that you understand that it would be very helpful for you to subscribe to this podcast. Just where the little box is, just click on that, click the little bell, and then that way you know every time something new comes from Redeemer Bible Church, whether it's our online sermons, our live streams, our weekly ministries, our podcasts, or the daily word. You will find everything that we're putting out. You'll find that very simply if you do that. So Craig, it is a pleasure to be with you again. And you and I spoke about a week ago, and you said that there are some things that took place that it would be really helpful if we had a follow-up podcast. So can you just kind of help all of us understand what happened and what we should take from these things?
Great. Thank you, John. It's great to be back again as well. Yes. A number of things have been going on, and I've been talking to a number of people and interacting with a number of individuals. And there's some good things, and there's a lot of disconcerting things going on. There's a lot of confusion. People are conflating ideas and concepts. To be blunt, it's showing that they don't really have a handle on it. And there's some emotions are running high, and understandably, because racism is a serious issue, and some people have been on the receiving end of that for a long time. And again, we assuredly want to say very clearly that we are against all forms of racism. That's
Amen.
wrong, but that doesn't mean, therefore, things like critical race theory should follow. So I want to address these confusions I'm seeing on both sides, John. And this is just so, if there's anything systemic here, it's so prevalent, it is critical race theory and the popularity of these ideas among John and Joan Q public, not just John and Joan Q academic. So if we could jump into that, here's some examples. Again, and as you mentioned, it would be helpful because I'm going to jump into this with both feet. And so some people may go, wow, this is really over my head. Well, you need the dialogues, the previous ones, to make sense of some of this, because I'm going to start going for the key issues and using concepts and terms that may be new to people.
Yeah.
But for example, what I'm seeing is, even in, for example, in the Southern Baptists, their platform from 2019, Resolution 9, it talked about the value of critical race theory, some of its analytic tools. Analytic tools is a quote, the direct words from that. And I want to push this again. I'm looking for distinctions, definitions, or definitions, distinctions, and then and only then dialogue, discussion. And so I'm still seeing people not defining these tools. What are these tools you're referring to? Now, a little later on, I'm going to mention some of them I think they're referring to, but we just keep hearing about these tools, this vague concept of tools. And you say, well, what could be wrong with that if these tools give us insight? But what I want to show is there's a lot of question begging, and the Latin is petitio principii, the begging of the question, circular reasoning. Again, people are conflating things like Black Lives Matter, the slogan or the idea, which I'm all for, versus Black Lives, the organization. Those are related, but two different issues. One is clearly a Marxist or neo-Marxist organization, the latter. And so going back to Resolution 9 as an example of this, it talks about these analytic tools. It also talks about the misuse of critical race theory. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean critical race theory itself is misused, that is itself is illegitimate? I think they're not trying to say that, but it appears they're referring to some misuse of critical race theory. So that leads to the obvious question, what is the non-misuse? What is the correct use of it? Right. And I'm saying that's messed up from the word go, that there are problems and difficulties with that. One more thing is, for right now, just putting the stuff on the table. We're going to be cooking, making a mess, a lot of things on the table. Hopefully we'll have a nice dish when we're done. But people are confusing critical race theory with critical theory. Critical race theory comes out of critical theory. Indeed, it came out of critical legal studies. There's a whole family of these views: femcrit, latcrit, queercrit, critical race theory, and on and on and on it goes. By the way, some people keep throwing postmodernism in here as if it somehow comes out of critical theory. That's not true. Postmodernism is a different movement. It often runs concurrent with critical theory or critical race theory, but it itself is a separate ideology. And the two really causally are not connected. That confusion needs to be cleared up. That doesn't really follow. But let me explain. Here is, John, here's from a piece from the Denver University, their library. And they talk about the tenets of critical race theory. It's brief. I'm going to read this. And then 5 further tenets. They say, and I quote, regarding critical race theory, 2 tenets. The first is to understand how a regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of color has been created and maintained in America. And in particular, to examine the relationship between that social structure and professed ideas such as the rule of law and equal protection. The second is a desire to not merely to understand the Beck's bond between law and racial power, but its change. So again, this came out of legal studies. Derek Bell actually studied law. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, one of his most famous students, if not the most famous student, again, studied law, teaches, oversees a department on critical theory at UCLA. Now, they also mentioned 5 other tenets related to this. Really, they're not different. They're just a cashing out of what we just read. They would include, in any order, the centrality and intersectionality of race and racism. That's kind of ambiguous. We'll come back to that. Challenge to dominant ideology, which would be whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege. That's what's in mind there. A commitment to social justice. And you say, well, who can disagree with social justice? Now, we've already talked about this at length, so I won't spend much time there today. Yeah. But what I do want to definitely look at today is experiential knowledge and counter storytelling. That's experiential knowledge and counter storytelling. And lastly, interdisciplinary perspectives. Well, I'm not going to tangle with interdisciplinary perspectives. No kidding. That's not a problem per se. But this experiential knowledge and counter storytelling is an issue. Indeed, I would argue that Daniel Farber and Susanna Sherry, in their book, Beyond All Reason, The Radical Assault on Truth in American Law. Again, Beyond All Reason, subtitled The Radical Assault on Truth in American Law, go through and show you what the problems are with these so-called counter narratives or storytelling. The point is sometimes it does share people's perspective and it helps us understand them, but sometimes their perspective is jaded, is incorrect. We had mentioned in a previous talk about I might feel I'm having a heart attack. Phenomenologically is a technical term. I'm experiencing having a heart attack. Let's say I'm having an 8 out of 10 on the pain scale, and I'm convinced this chest pain and radiating down my arms and so on and so forth is a heart attack. But in fact, when I go to the hospital, they run the tests, do the EKG and the other tests, and they say, no, actually, you didn't have a heart attack, but you do have a hiatal hernia, and that will cause the same sensation. But I protest and say, no, I had the experience. It's my experience. You didn't have it. I know I had a heart attack.
Right.
With all due respect, epistemologically, I am incorrect. How I know this is experientially, but it's fact wrong. And so what happens is people start sometimes telling stories that are not based in reality. Now, even that is a loaded concept. So, for example, think of the 1619 Project, originally proposed as history, the real history of America, starting in 1619, and America being founded explicitly for the purpose of promulgating slavery. Now, I'm not saying slavery hasn't been around and there weren't many people, the founding fathers or otherwise, who did not support slavery. We know they did. Many of them did. But that story itself has been busted by a number of historians who said, look, you've got a number of things factually incorrect. They're just not true. You have either no support for some of your claims and or some of your claims are just patently false. And so now the main writers and editors of that have come along and said, okay, well, yeah, it's not meant to be historical facticity. It's meant to give an alternative narrative. It's to change the narrative in America. Now think about that. That's a radically different perspective, going from factual analysis. Here's a crime that happened, or a car accident. Here's how it happened. We find a person who's dead in a room, and we want to know why. Was it suicide? Was it natural causes? Was it foul play or an accident? But when you just say, well, I'm just trying to tell a narrative and there's no actual person that died, I'm trying to relate some, ambiance or what have you, that's completely different. And so we have to be careful. This counter storytelling or changing the narrative can be made up of whole cloth. So it's one thing to try to get people to empathize with us and understand where we're coming from. It's another thing to present that as if it's basically factual. And you say, well, how's that happening? Well, for example, we're told that racism is systemic, that almost all whites, if not all whites, that is not just being white, but whiteness, the attributes of whiteness as a worldview, as an ideology. It's not just being white, but it's so-called white privilege and all the things that go with it, allegedly. To talk as if empirically that's a given fact. It's one thing if someone feels that way. It's one thing if someone has been discriminated against, but we can attribute to our experience a cause that's simply not there. Just quickly, I mentioned James Lindsay sitting on the tarmac. Their flight was delayed, and they said it was because a giant weather storm was coming up and they had to redirect their path and needed time to redo that. And an individual relatively close to him was complaining, thinking the airlines were just trying to rip him off somehow. It was all about money and they didn't really care because he couldn't see any storm. But James Lindsay had his phone with him and he got on a weather site. And in fact, there was this massive storm out of eyesight at that time. But in fact, there was a storm in their flight path. But this other individual attributes his experience to ulterior motives of the airlines. We've talked about this before, this analogy, but I think it's very apropos. So here's another concern of mine that segues into this, John, is that there are people who are saying, and Christians who are saying this, I don't buy into critical race theory. Why? Because I'm not a Marxist and I'm not an atheist. I'm a Christian. And I'm not a Marxist, maybe a socialist, but not a Marxist. But what they're doing is, while they say that, and they may be doing that with all good intentions, in fact, they're subscribing to almost all, if not all, the major tenets of critical race theory or critical theory.
Right.
So the idea of systemic racism, for example, or the privilege or the priority of the voices of color, that those should be listened to exclusively, if not predominantly, certainly sometimes exclusively over white voices. In other words, their experience matters. Or intersectionality, if someone is, say, not only a person of color, but is transgender or homosexual or lesbian, well, then their voice should count even more. When we're talking about reality and experience, their learned experience trumps everybody else's because of their intersectionality, which is the multiplying of various factors that people allegedly are discriminated for. So
Craig, I have a question for you on this. So there are number of questions have come up on this, and I think what I've had people tell me is that one of the responses that they get from pastors or leaders or whoever who is trying to distance themselves from critical race theory, but also also imbibing some of the ideas, is this. So this is one that I've heard from people who will say, well, problem is that you guys don't care about feelings. All you care about is facts. But if you found a family member with a broken leg outside, the first thing you would want to know is, are they okay? There'd be an emotional response, and then you'd want to know what happened. But there's nothing wrong with that emotional response, and emotions matter. Emotions matter deeply, and so we can't just discount the emotions because they're significant, and just say no. We're all about the facts.
Well, and I would agree, as it's given. But the problem is, this turns into a false analogy. So, if a loved one or otherwise has a broken leg or otherwise injured, of course I would hope to have sympathy, if not empathy, at least sympathy for them, and to be emotionally engaged. But I can't let my emotions so cloud my judgment. So let's say Indeed, let's say a loved one is in a car wreck outside of my house, and it's a horrific wreck, and I'm obviously emotionally invested and distraught over that. But what happens if I panic and I start thinking unclearly, and I just kind of run around and I'm actually trying to move them, which is a mistake, instead of calling 911 and just trying to make sure they're stabilized and don't go into shock. Yeah. So my emotions, if they get the better of me and they overrule logic and reason, then now I'm actually ironically harming the very person that I feel so strongly about and want to help them. And sometimes there are emotions. I don't think it has to be a conflict, but sometimes they are. Right. Sometimes we let our emotions run roughshod. It's the proverbial caboose leading the train instead of vice versa. So in those cases, we have to be careful. And I realize there are people who have experienced, brothers and sisters and non-Christians, who've experienced racism, inappropriate discrimination. And I don't want to make light of that. And I want to have compassion and empathy. But I can't thereby institute tenets of a worldview that are antithetical to a biblical worldview. So if I say, example, epistemologically speaking, theory of knowledge, these views are true. People have experienced racism. Therefore, anytime there's a person of color, their story always trumps anybody else's story. Their story always should be told and the other should be quiet, and it should be listened to and believed. But the problem with that is that assumes that one group is always right and another is wrong just because of their color, because of their experiences. Look, a surgeon may have all kinds of experiences or not, and they may come from different parts of the world. If I need heart surgery, I don't really care much about all their other experiences. I want their knowledge of the heart, of cardiology, to be sound to help me. And so people are committing this identity politics, standpoint politics, but in this case, standpoint epistemology, that something is true by definition because it comes from a particular group, not just a person, but a group of people united by their color, social economic status, age, gender or lack thereof, all those things, sexual preference. And another group is wrong simply because they come from a different group. And this is another fallacy where you are throwing a person's views out because of their identity. Like, for example, males can't really speak about certain things because they're males. They're just automatically wrong. Or females, vice versa. That is not sound reasoning. And it denies sound biblical principles that we're all messed up. We all have insights and we all have things that we miss. There's no one group of people, however united by social economic status, sexual preference, gender fluidity, color, that makes them right and another one wrong. And that's a problem. So if I say I'm always going to privilege the one group, always I'll use the phrase, at the expense of the other group or groups, there's a problem with that. And not just a sense of fairness, it's a radical assumption. This group is always right and this group is always wrong. And that is just unbiblical. And in every other area of life, that's nonsense. If I go to an investment counselor, I'm looking for good investment advice. I frankly, other than a moral issue, that is not investing in, let's say, pornography or things that are totally wrong, drugs, stores that selling drugs that I don't agree with, so forth. I don't care the color of their skin. I don't care. There's all these other factors. I want sound financial advice. And I don't go, well, the white ones are always wrong and people of color are always right or vice versa. That's silliness.
It's racism, actually. It's what it is.
Yes. So I want to come back to a concept here, John. We've mentioned it before, but I want to push it up a little more. So again, we often use what's called methodological pragmatism. Again, I come in a room, I find a dead person. And I want to know. I call the police, or I say I work for the police or the coroner. And I want to know, though, how did they die? Why are they here? How did they get here? And then I want to know, how did they die? Because if it's an accident, well, that's serious. But I mean, that's one way to look at it. If I'm the coroner. What if it's of natural causes? Let's say they had a heart attack, fell off a ladder, broke their neck or something. Okay. But if it's suicide, that's a different matter. But if it's foul play, if it's murder, that's completely different. So I can have a methodology, an approach to try to analyze how a person got to where they are, or deceased, and how they died. But the problem is what we're seeing, and sometimes on both sides, we're seeing this presumption, not just, we call this a posteriori, that is prior to experience. We let the experience inform us. We have a method, but it's based upon experience, and the sense of it's just the raw data. It's a method. But we don't have an a priori approach. A priori is prior to experience. It means I've already made up my mind. So again, I go to an estate. The gal of that place is deceased. Looks like foul play, and I just believe that the butler did it. For some reason, I've got it in my mind the butler did it. But what happens if the evidence doesn't really point to the butler? What if we see where someone broke into the house, and from the impression left on the ground that they probably weighed 250 to 300 pounds, but the butler only weighs 110 dripping wet, that we find some cigar ashes under and over the body, and we find out the butler is deathly allergic to cigars, and so on and so forth. So one presupposes a method, and we all do that. I don't have a problem with that per se, as long as our method is reasonable and in light of a biblical worldview. But what happens when we presuppose something that is not true, not sound, and or unbiblical? The idea, for example, that any particular group is always right or almost always right, and the other one is wrong or almost always wrong. Now we're in trouble. And because, again, racism exists and we ought to be compassionate and caring about people who experience this, but I can't let my emotions run away and just go, therefore, everything they say is true. God forbid. Let's use another horrific example. A gal is raped. That's horrible, unspeakable, unacceptable, obviously. Mm-hmm. But what if she starts saying things that are not true? A number of famous cases. For example, there was a young girl, a teenager, who said she was raped. And of course, who doesn't empathize with that person? And she blamed one individual who actually, by the way, happened to be a person of color. They went to prison for a very long time. Later on, it was actually proven that, in fact, he didn't do it. So there's an example. We can't let our emotions, our compassion, and rightly so for someone who's, violated to rape, therefore convict somebody on a set of presumptions or ideas that are, in fact, not based in reality. So go ahead, John.
Yeah. So what I'm seeing too is there are words, theological concepts, let's say sin, for instance, and in these theological concepts, they're imported things like systemic racism. So all human beings are sinful. So obviously there are going to be systemic problems with sin, and one of those systemic problems is racism. So it follows from the very fact that there's sin in the world that systemic racism is an issue. And so I'm seeing it with love too. I need to love my neighbor. And so all manner of non-scientific, non-evidentiary things are being pushed on a public simply because, we need to love our neighbors. And so help us think through that.
Well, sure. I see somebody who's on the streets and my heart goes out to them. Hopefully I don't look down upon them and pridefully. But does that mean I just give them money? Well, the odds are the evidence seems to support that money generally ends up going to drugs or otherwise, not for shelter or for food. So my heart can and should go out to compassion to, for example, a homeless person, but that doesn't mean the fix is automatically give them money. Yeah. And again, we see somebody struggling financially, but maybe they have $1,000 car payment. They're paying for, this literally happens. Yeah. And you're just like, you can't afford $1,000 car payments. You're not working. You have been looking for a job. Paul tells us if a person will not work, they will not eat. He tells us in Timothy about those who are not really widows, are not old enough, or can go and work. We don't just go, oh, my heart goes out to you because you're struggling. There's a number of reasons people struggle. So we can't just go by our emotions. We have to do an analysis biblically and reasonably, rationally. I would argue that is the way to go, biblically and rationally. People will say, wait a minute, that sounds like modernism and empiricism. Jesus himself uses the 4 major laws of logic, for example, in Matthew.
Absolutely.
And indeed, the greatest command is we're to love God with all our heart, soul, mind. And the word is dianoia, not nous. Logical, rational capacities. And so we bring that to bear on the image of God and to love people, meet where they are. but there is emotionalism on both sides. My concern is, John, on many of these matters, there's much more heat being generated than light. And on both sides, so when you say misuse of critical race theory, well, okay, what's the good use of it? Yeah. You say you don't hold to it, but you hold to systemic racism, the priority of voices of color, white fragility, all these other things. Those are all the planks of critical race theory. You may not hold it in name, but in content, you are subscribing to that. And we're seeing that in the church, in churches, and in Christian colleges and universities. And then people, oh, we're not teaching that. Yes, you are. I mean, come on, have a come to Jesus moment here. Let's either get with it and realize what you're doing, or be honest and say, I do hold to this, and I am teaching it because I believe it's biblical. And then we can at least have that dialogue.
Yeah, and so that's where I find that when it comes to a conversation like that, yes, we disavow, we disagree with critical race theory. My response to that is, well, define critical race theory for me. Help me understand what that is, and that's when I get crickets. That's right. When I get blank stares. And so you're telling me you don't agree with something, but you don't even know how to define it, number one. And then number two, you talk about issues from the standpoint of critical race theory, and you don't even know you're doing it because you don't know what it is.
Right. And I'm seeing both sides that do this. And so someone on the other side are saying, well, you guys can't even accurately describe it. So obviously you don't know what you're talking about. Now, one can be guilty of the trivial objection fallacy that, in fact, someone doesn't describe it completely accurate or with the right verbiage, but they're still getting the heart of it. On the other hand, both sides seem to be misunderstanding it. That's why someone might say, well, you guys haven't defined it today. But in the previous sessions, we went through it very thoroughly and explained what critical race theory is, the various types, the narrow and broad definitions, and the different disciplines. But I'm really concerned, John, because I've seen so much of this in the church, in Christian colleges and universities, and a lack of ownership, whether it's literally they just don't understand the implications of what they're teaching, or they're just not willing to own it. They're not willing to be honest. It's very disconcerting to me to see such silliness going on in the church. And with things I believe, critical race theory itself, that is composed of critical theory of neo-Marxism and neo-Freudianism, is antithetical to the gospel. And people are trying to bring it in. To me, it is a Trojan horse. You're trying to bring something into the citadel of God, the kingdom of God, that doesn't belong there. You're trying to baptize, sanctify something that is, I'm going to use the word sinful. That is, if you understand what neo-Marxism is, whether or not one's an atheist, and Neo-Freudianism is, you see that they're incompatible with Christianity.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's not only a false gospel, it's a false way of viewing the world. Just completely. It's a false understanding of God, of creation, of what a human being is, what our problem is, what the solution is, what our destinies are. It has a false understanding of knowledge and of ethics. It is false in every possible way compared to Christianity. And yet, what we're hearing is that we've got to take some of its analytical tools and use it in some way to advance the gospel. And it kind of blows me away that we're even having this conversation, because the watchmen in the larger evangelical world are asleep on this one, or instead of watching for the invading army, they're in the invading army coming after us. And so it seems like when we're talking about this, it's like we're protecting a candle from a tsunami. And so just wondering about how you're seeing all of that.
Well, it is, I'm not into conspiracy theories, but it is very pervasive in the church, the world. It's across the board, all over the place, in academia and education, and not just the philosophy of education, actually educating of educators, and then they're teaching it. Let me use maybe two examples here. Number one, let's deal with what's called convergent interests. That's a term coined by Derek Bell, really one of the main popularizers or inventors of critical race theory from his studies of critical theory from Duncan Kennedy and others he studied with. So what we have here is basically the idea that whiteness, people who are involved in whiteness, the mentality, they only help or benefit people of color if it benefits them. So I never would do anything that would actually help somebody else because I'm not being altruistic to care about them. It's always that I'm going to get something out of it myself. Now let me say this. Certainly at times that's true. Certainly there's times where it's a win-win. It's mutually beneficial to all parties. But the idea that it's always only the case that because it benefits us, that is so jaded. That is so twisted. So that's not healthy. And of course, by the way, why is it that they think that it's always we're the ones who are being selfish and narcissistic, and they're the ones who are being altruistic? That's a big problem. Now, I would argue, as a human being looking at this, as someone with a background in theology and philosophy and so forth, I am concerned. I'm very concerned about this. And I would have a pessimistic viewpoint. I'd have a pessimistic perspective. But I am confident in the God of the universe, the God of Christianity, the God of the Bible, the one true and living God, that he's even Lord of this, that he can deal with this. This is one more. It is a tsunami. I think that's an apt description. But it's one more tsunami. It's one more. And the church has dealt with these in the past by the power of God, by the word of God, by the power of the Holy Spirit. So I think we ought to be loving. We ought to be kind. Now, I know there's some are saying, oh, well, obviously this is white fragility. You guys are freaking out over this. Obviously, this pushback is white fragility.
Right.
Maybe it's not that. Maybe it is love. Maybe I'm speaking the truth in love. As we've said before, quoting Paul, have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? I would argue love divorced from truth is a worse form of hate. Because we love people, we're willing to speak to these issues and try to bring wholeness in a biblical worldview to these ideas. So humanly speaking, I'd be very pessimistic. This is not going to go well. Right. I think it's serious, but I believe God is still sovereign and in control. And as we prayerfully and as much as possible, humbly and considerately, but nonetheless hold the line as we advance this, then I'm believing that hopefully this too will pass.
And so is a rejection of the social justice movement or critical race theory in particular, is that equivalent to being a racist? Because I'm hearing that today as well.
One more time, John.
So is the denial of critical race theory or the social justice movement in general, is that the same thing as racism, being a racist? So you are racist because you reject critical race theory.
Let me use an analogy. I'm going to say no. That's my straightforward answer. That would be like saying, because I believe there's only one way to God, that there is only one name given under heaven among people whereby we must be saved, that I'm a bigot, that I'm intolerant. That doesn't follow at all. If you have a fatal illness, a terminal disease, and there's only one cure, one efficacious approach to it, I'm not being a bigot or an obscurantist or a narrow-minded, whatever you want to call me, by saying, no, this is the way you have to do it. You have this condition, this is the only medication or medical procedure to heal it. So we've heard this before when it comes to our pluralistic world, pluralism as far as epistemologically speaking and polytheism as far as God, the same thing. We're told we're intolerant, we're bigoted, we're unloving. No, I would say we're being loving by speaking the truth that you can try this. You want to drive your car 50 miles an hour down the road and the bridge is out around the corner. I happen to know this. I'm not being unloving by telling you to stop or to slow down so you don't go off the bridge. So I would say no.
Yeah, there's also one last question. There's also this third wayism that it's not full-blown critical race theory, and it's not the rejection of critical race theory. The truth is always somewhere in the middle. So, and you talked before about using the analytical tools, but which are the tools that are okay to use and which aren't? Explain to me what should we use from critical race theory and what shouldn't we use? And so help us think through that as well.
Yes, I think every idea has to be vetted. We need to ask questions. What do you mean by critical theory, by critical race theory? There's a well-known public figure in the Southern Baptist, could be any other convention, has a very prevalent platform. And they were responding to the 6 presidents of the Southern Baptist Seminary statement about that we reject all forms or all versions of critical theory, but they substituted the term critical race theory. In other words, that's sloppy thinking. They weren't careful. They confused critical race theory, related to critical theory, but they're not the same. And so we need to stop and define our terms and ask, what do you mean by that? How do you know this? How do you know this is true or false? Why do you think that? And we do need to be patient and loving with one another and have these dialogues. Tell me why you believe this. Why do you think this? How do you understand this? So convergent interest. Are you telling me, do you really believe that whenever, let's say, someone from a given perspective, whiteness, does something, it's always because it's somehow benefiting them, that it's never simply altruistic? How do you know this? And I do believe in praying and trusting God as well to give us wisdom. But I think we've got to pursue this, we have to be willing to dialogue. If the discussion is going to end, it has to be with others who simply will not discuss it with us. There's a major pastor in Houston, Texas, who's just outraged with this recent statement of these 6 presidents of these seminaries in the Southern Baptist Convention, and he's disassociating himself and disavowing his relationship with their seminaries, with denomination. I don't doubt this person has experienced a lot of racism and discrimination. I'm not disputing that. And I want to have a heart of compassion towards that, what he, his family, and people he cares about have experienced. But when he equates saying that what they said now is basically supporting racism, I can't go there with him. So I want to ask, why do you think that? Why are you feeling this way? So let's acknowledge the feelings. Let's be respectful of them. I can respect your feelings and still disagree with you and say, with all due respect, I have to propose another scenario, another form of analysis. I think these will go a long ways, John, to trying to diffuse much of this, minimally to diffuse the, again, more heat than light scenario that I think we're seeing so much of, and bring this stuff to light. Let me just say this. There are many academics, provosts, presidents of major Christian, so-called real and imagined universities, and they're totally into this. And I think the parents who pay the money, the donors, I have one friend who's a major donor of a major Christian university. He's told the president, I'm not giving you any money anymore until you fix this. And he knows other people and he's telling them the same thing. We're not supporting this. I think, civilly, respectfully, not overly emotional, not raising our voices, getting wrathful, angry, but speaking to this and we're not going to allow this. Explain this to us. Tell me how and why you believe this.
So, as I want to wrap this up, is there anything else that you're seeing out there that you want to make Christians aware of? Because this is like an amoeba; it's constantly moving, changing, shifting. And is there anything like on the front line of the things that you're seeing that Christians need to be aware about?
Just how radically pervasive this is, and to stop and ask questions. And if you see something that concerns you, you don't have to go crazy, but we ought to get involved. I want to come back to something you said earlier, this third way, Aristotle's so-called golden means, the via media, don't drive on the right or left, drive down the center. That's not always possible. And sometimes when people are thinking they're taking a middle or neutral approach, they're not. We're back to this pragmatic view of truth. They've already had buy-in, not just to a method, but to content. It's one thing, again, to presuppose an ends, but sometimes we confuse ends and means, and we've presupposed both of them, and we've compromised our position. So stop, think, pray, talk with people, and say, no, if we have the chance, am I understanding you correctly? Is this what you're saying? Is this what you believe? And is this why you believe this? I believe it's not a silver bullet, a magic pill, but it can go a long ways with a lot of prayer and genuine interest, concern, and sensitivity to people. Again, I can be sensitive to someone who reports being raped. I shouldn't assume they're lying. They're not true. Make them, you obviously brought this on yourself. But that doesn't mean I have to literally subscribe to everything they say. If the data doesn't support how they say what happened to them happened, I'm going to have to go with that evidence. And they do the same thing. We just have to point that out to them by the word of God, the power of God, the Spirit of God.
Yeah, we do it all the time. That's how we can't live our lives any other way, really.
John, nobody does. We all use logic. We all use reason. And so I would ask people just to think it through. Again, when they say basically these experiences are always valid, yours are always invalid or not true. How do you know that? That's a form of the contextual fallacy. The contextual fallacy based upon related concepts like relativism, social constructivism, and that basically says there's no universals. Here we go. You're biased, you're unduly biased by, let's say, in this case, your whiteness. You're unduly biased. And so you can't get out of that. But why would I presuppose that you're not unduly biased by your colorness? Exactly. In other words, it seems to be we're both wrong. So let's find what is true, what we can agree on, not just the middle ground, but what we both believe and practice to be as true, and go from there. But the contextual fallacy says there's no universals except my view, that you are universally wrong. But other than that, everybody's unduly biased, epistemologically, morally, feeling-wise. Everybody's unduly biased, overly influenced by X, Y, and Z, except for me. Come on. Really?
Nobody has the view from on top of the mountain except for me, who's on top of the mountain.
Yes, I can tell you that nobody knows the full truth because I know the full truth and nobody else knows it.
Exactly. Well, Craig, I really appreciate your time today, and very grateful for you, very grateful for whoever it was walking in the back while we were having this conversation. It adds a real life feel to it. It adds a sense that we're just people trying to figure these things out, trying to live lives that honor God and love people, and so whatever context we find ourselves in. And so we're very grateful for that. Very grateful for you. And if you're watching and you want to know more about these things, you want to be more connected to Craig's ministry, Craig, how would they do that?
They can contact me at C. Hawkins at tiu.edu. I teach at Trinity Law School. C. Hawkins at tiu.edu. They can also go online. You can visit the website, the College of Theology, no hyphens, no spaces.com, the collegeoftheology.com. Also, they can listen to our radio program. Myself and my colleagues, I co-host a radio program that airs live on Sunday nights on KKLA 99.5 FM, Southern California, but it's on the internet. You can listen to it. So that's a number of ways. You can contact me via email, Twitter, Facebook. We have all those methods. But again, a great way is through the live radio program. Again, that's what Living by the Word, Sunday nights on KKLA live with myself and my colleagues.
Craig, well, that's very helpful. And I really hope for those of you watching that you take advantage of it. I know for me, I've watched, listened, read so much of what Craig has produced, and it's really benefited me and really helped me think through tons of issues, including the social justice movement. And so thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you next time for another episode of Redeeming Truth. Take care.